You're watching Inform TV, Alexandria, Minnesota.
Well, thank you for that introduction. Thank you for having me here today. I am from a place called the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, so we care very deeply about the opportunities in any community, whether it's in energy, which is my field, or the many other areas in which we work about how communities can capture more of their own dollars. We work in retail, we work in publicly owned broadband networks. We have a waste-to-wealth program that works on recycling, composting, all of these different sectors of our economy where there's a lot of opportunity to capture more of our dollars. So what I want to talk about is, as was mentioned, I'm the director of our Democratic Energy Program, which is kind of a way of capturing that notion of not only generating energy close to where we use it, but also democratizing the ownership. My talk's a little different here than when it is in, when I'm speaking to folks in big cities who are served by investor-owned utilities. As was mentioned earlier, this is cooperative territory, or in the city of Alexandria, it's a municipally owned utility, and there already is democratic ownership. And so the talk is a little different because the structure is already in place for the decision-making that can lead to more capture of that local energy dollar, that can lead to more democratic control. But what I would like to do is talk about two themes that really underlie the kind of work that I do in my approach to energy. And that's really this issue of self-reliance, which is in the name of our institute, but also this notion of economic development, because those two pieces are really what I think frames up why the technology changes that are happening in the electricity system offer a lot of hope for changing how we use our energy dollars. So I wanted to start off with democratic energy in the 20th century, sort of how we got started with this notion of democratic energy, and it really does start with stories like you have with the REA. So, on the Runestone website, there's this, nice story in the history, talks about volunteers going door to door, signing up farmers for $5 a share. I was actually giving a presentation in Texas about 2-3 years ago at the Pedernales Electric Cooperative. It's one of the largest in Texas. And same story, they have it on a plaque outside the building, talking about how the first members went around and collected those donations under the Rural Electrification Act, and a dramatic rise in electrification resulted. And it was this notion of self-reliance, that these communities could not be served by the investor-owned utilities, who essentially wrote them off. They said that it was not cost-effective to go out and to bring that electricity service. Nobody would ever want to do it. And really, the local folks proved them wrong and said, actually, we can make it happen and we can do it on our own. And what did it do? It brought all of these great benefits to the community that were, not only quality of life issues, but also sources of economic development. So there's this excellent article on this website called the New Deal Network. It has this letter written by a member of an electric cooperative in Kentucky after her farmhouse was connected to the electricity system, about all of the benefits that they were able to have. And she kind of goes through the list, sort of like, well, we started with lights, and it was so great to be able to read like later into the night. And then we had the radio, because our neighbors had had a radio. They had a battery operated radio, and now they had it was hooked up to the grid, and then they had a refrigerator, and then she had a washing machine. She didn't have to use a gasoline operated washing machine, and this one was quiet and it was efficient. So all of these benefits, and then writ large, just an enormous opportunity in agriculture and for farming to have electrification. And again, this opportunity that electricity brought, folks pooling together their resources to bring it to their community, and recognizing that it was a source not only of economic development, but that they would have to do it themselves. And really, my message is that that's the same kind of philosophy that we are going to bring to energy and electricity in the 21st century, that it really is going to still be about this notion of self-reliance and about economic development, and the institutions that brought it to us in the 20th century are positioned to do that for the 21st century. So I want to talk first about the valuable nature of democratic energy or distributed generation, and why that technology is going to play such an important role. So this is, it was alluded to earlier about Minnesota's solar energy mandate that passed this last spring in 2013. And one key piece of this is what's called the value of solar. It's actually, I believe, going to be decided at the Public Utilities Commission today, which is a formula that utilities will use, and investor-owned utilities, if they should apply for this program, to calculate how much each electron that comes off a solar PV system is worth to the utility. And the notion here is that whereas normally a utility would go out and as mentioned before, go on the wholesale market and buy electricity, and it comes from whatever source is the most economical at that time, Solar is a little bit different in the sense that it tends to produce at a time of day that can be very valuable, especially on hot summer afternoons. It serves air conditioning loads. It meets those peak demand periods. It often offsets power production from very expensive power plants. It also does avoid those line losses and things because you can put it right on the rooftop of the building where you're using energy. So that even though you can't use solar to get 100% of your energy, because we all know the sun does go down at night, when you do get those solar electrons, they can actually be more valuable than just sort of any old electron. And that's true of any resource that would produce energy at this time of day. It's not unique to solar, but it's just that solar has a production profile that can be very valuable to utilities. And what we've seen in this process is that, and I put an asterisk on it, that 14.5 cents a kilowatt hour is what Xcel Energy reported that when they used the draft methodology that the Department of Commerce had developed under this law, that's what they thought that number would come out to be, 14.5 cents. And as for a comparison, as mentioned earlier, the retail price, what we pay when we use electricity, is maybe 11 cents or 12 cents a kilowatt hour as customers. So it's worth more than that retail price under that draft methodology. Now that's going to be debated a little bit more. That number's going to float around a little bit. But the basic notion is that this solar energy has some real value, and you can see on the chart there what those values are. The fact that it replaces other energy, it avoids some transmission losses, it has some environmental value in terms of avoiding pollution that comes from other grid sources, and also has local energy capacity value. I could go into a lot of technical detail about that, but I'll kind of leave it here, sort of this notion that this energy can be particularly valuable to our grid system. This one I want to frame as a question, which is, how much money do you think we spend collectively as residents of Minnesota importing essentially fossil fuels to serve our energy needs? This is beyond electricity. This is all of our energy needs. So what do people think? I've given you a hint. It's in the billions.
32 billion.
7 billion, 32 billion. You're in the ballpark. It's about $20 billion a year. And the notion here is that now that we have this shift happening in the technology around electricity, now it's not going to solve everything. We're not going to get all $20 billion back, but that we have this opportunity, it's really a $20 billion potential. It has been money that we spend exporting to other places. We don't have coal mines in Minnesota. We don't have any natural gas fracking happening in Minnesota. We don't have uranium mines, so all of these resources that we use to generate electricity have been coming from outside the state. Whereas we have an enormous renewable energy resource, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And so we have $20 billion in potential savings and potential dollars that we can bring back into our economies, our local economies, our communities, that we have been sending outside the state for these fossil fuels. And that's an opportunity that we now have the technology to start tapping into. The second piece of that is not only can we bring those dollars back in by purchasing the fuel locally or building systems that use free fuel that falls or blows through Minnesota, but that if we have local ownership, as in a cooperative, that we get a much greater economic impact. So every dollar that we invest in a locally owned renewable energy system can return up to 3 or 4 times more than a system that is absentee owned. So if somebody came in from Iowa and said, I want to put up a wind turbine around Alexandria, versus it being built by the cooperative itself, the economic impact can be much greater if that system can be locally owned. So again, another opportunity to recapture those energy dollars that we've been sending away and keep them in our community. There's one other piece I think that's really important, and this is the results of a survey that was done in Germany. They had 2 towns that they surveyed that both had nearby wind power projects. And they asked the residents of those towns, what do you think about adding more wind power near your community? And the difference between the 2 towns was that in one case, the community owned that wind farm. It was like a cooperative of the members of that community owned that wind power project, and in the other community, it wasn't locally owned. And you can see here that the opinion of folks towards increasing the amount of wind energy development in their community was dramatically different when there was local ownership. So not only does it, and I guess what I would say is, given that I have just talked about the fact that we have much greater economic opportunity, it's no surprise that this is the result. When we develop these projects in a way, people recognize, it's not just that turbine is spinning and bringing the electricity from a clean resource, it's that's also spinning dollars into our local economy. And so it's a very different attitude toward wind power than we have sometimes seen, where when the development is coming from outside entities, from large corporations that are based outside of Minnesota, that there's more resistance to that development. So there's a lot of value then in distributed resources and this notion of democratic energy, and I want to talk a little bit about how it can also be very cost effective. There's this notion among sort of nerds like me that spend a lot of time on energy about solar parity. And this is the point of intersection where as the cost of installing solar and producing electricity from solar is coming down, as the cost of buying energy from the grid is going up, that there will at some point be this intersection where it will actually be cheaper for me to be buying that electricity or to be producing it myself than to be buying it from the utility. And there's sort of two different lines involved here. One is sort of solar with subsidies, because there's a tax credit from the federal government, and sometimes there are local incentives. And then there's this notion of unsubsidized parity. And so my question would be, how fast are electricity prices rising? Because one of the things that's difficult in my business is talking to people. Folks kind of think that the system that we're in is fixed, that what I pay for electricity is what I'm going to be paying for electricity, and so that if there's a difference between that and the cost of solar now, it's going to persist forever. So on an annual basis, what do you think has been the average percentage increase in the cost of electricity? Year to year, over the past, I think 5 to 10 years is what I've done here. Any guesses?
3%.
We got a guess, good. 4.7%. I got this data from the Energy Information Administration. It's an average for Runestone. It is not necessarily what is reflected on your bill. They have a different method of calculating it than the rates that you're paying. But about 4.7% per year. There are a lot of factors into this, and it's not meant to be a criticism. It's a recognition of the way that things are going in the energy system. It can be because of fuel costs, like natural gas or coal. It can be because of infrastructure upgrades, like the CapEx project for transmission lines. It can be needed infrastructure upgrades for the local distribution system. But the point being, electricity prices are rising. What we're paying for energy is going up, and the cost of energy from alternatives like solar is coming down. And so what we're looking here now, you can see on the bottom that this runs out to about 2020, which is incidentally the end of the solar energy mandate, the 1.5% mandate that passed last year. And you have the average retail price. I just projected out it rising at the same rate over the next decade, which is by no means, as they say in the investment world, past performance is not indicative of future results. But so take that with a grain of salt. And then what I've charted for you is a projection in the cost of solar electricity coming down. I looked at residential solar arrays. This is based in part on historical prices, and then also a projection, a fairly conservative projection based on the continuing drop in that cost. And you have 3 dotted lines here. The top one represents solar without any subsidies. What would be the cost of solar electricity if you couldn't get any rebates or tax credits or anything? The middle line is just with the federal 30% tax credit, and the bottom line is for commercial businesses that are able to take this depreciation benefit that is not available to residential customers. And the 3 red stars show you those points of intersection, that point of parity. And what that means is that, for example, under that net metering relationship that was provided earlier, that if I can use net metering, if I can roll my meter backwards, I'm actually going to be getting cheaper electricity from my own rooftop in this time frame than I would be able to get from the utility. And that has all sorts of fascinating implications for our energy system and for the economics of running utility business, frankly, that have to be addressed. But it's an opportunity as well, because what it is, first of all, is that it means there's going to be pressure on the utility to be able to compete with that. And whether that means that there are going to be policy changes or there are going to be decisions that have to be made on a utility basis or at a state level, things are changing as this is happening because the technology is opening up the door for customers to do something different and to get their energy from a different source. And then I want to talk a little, so I've talked about how that energy can be particularly valuable because of the nature of distributed energy and about how it can be cost effective, especially as we look forward. And I want to talk a little bit about the potential that we have to tap into this distributed energy. And this is a map from the report that was mentioned that I did called Energy Self-Reliance States that looks at the local renewable energy potential. So it looked at every state by state, and said when you look at the wind and the rooftop solar potential and maybe hydropower and geothermal, all of those things together, how much electricity could you get relative to how much electricity you sell in that state on a year-by-year basis? And basically, what is the percent that could be served? And we found that about 2/3 of states actually have more potential resource from renewables, commercially viable renewables. This is not, wind, a tiny wind turbine on the top of my house. This is a large utility scale turbine or a modest-sized rooftop solar array. could get more, could generate more locally than they use on a state in that basis. Now, this is not a technical study. This was not looking at hour by hour. Will you get enough from the wind and the sun to meet the electric load that there is? There are those kinds of issues in balancing supply and demand that are not accounted for. But what this talks about really is about the enormous economic opportunity. When we've been talking about $20 billion a year leaving our state to import fuel or import electricity generated from fuel that is not coming from within Minnesota, this represents an enormous economic opportunity to change that. And so a little bit more about that opportunity. This is a specific look at solar, rooftop solar, and it says, okay, well, knowing what we know about the cost of solar over time and that it's going down, and knowing what we know about electricity prices, which are always going up to a greater or lesser degree, in about a decade, what would that mean for how much solar we could install that would be competitive with the retail electricity prices that we have? And in Minnesota, by about 2022, it would be about 4,400 megawatts of solar that could be installed that would be competitive with our utility retail electricity prices. Now, this is not saying that we should do this. It's not saying that it would be economical for utilities. But what you see in Minnesota, that would be about between 5 and 10% of our electricity sales could be met by a resource, with a free fuel that would be at a lower cost than the retail electricity prices of the utility that those customers were normally getting their power from. So there is this really remarkable, not just could 100% of our energy come from these renewables, it could be coming from those renewables at a very economic price, at least for the customers, from the customer standpoint. And it's an opportunity not only to save money on energy bills, but of course to keep more of those energy dollars local, because when we're talking about this, in this case, distributed solar, rooftop solar, we're talking about generating it within the community and very close to where we use energy. And of course, there's some great examples of this already happening. I didn't know that someone from Lake Region Electric Cooperative would be here to talk about their community solar project, but I think it's a perfect example of how cooperatives and utilities are already finding ways to take advantage of this. Another example is the Wright-Hennepin Cooperative Electric Association. They serve kind of the northwestern metro area in the Twin Cities, also has a community solar project. But it's a way to kind of test out, in this period where solar is just starting to become economical, if we build it collectively, we can get a lower price, because when you build a solar array that's this size instead of a residential rooftop, there are some economies of scale, there's some savings. And then members can buy into this project rather than having to build it themselves, and the maintenance can be taken care of on a collective basis instead of everybody having to maintain their own panel. And so it's just an innovative way to start to explore this opportunity to get more of those energy dollars and keep them local. Another example on a relatively larger scale, the utility that serves Long Island near New York City recently put out for about 100 megawatts of solar. They're a fairly large utility relative to others. And for about 100 megawatts of solar they wanted developed on Long Island. And the idea behind it was that they knew their load was growing. They knew peak energy demand was growing. They knew that solar could meet that demand, and that they could save about $100 million in new power lines and substation upgrades to meet that energy demand if they could instead get it from local solar. So there was this, so I think what it does is it really highlights not only that issue of the value that I talked about earlier about solar energy. They can keep those energy dollars local again because they're not importing energy from somewhere else, but they can also save money on their infrastructure by using that to meet some of their peak demands. And there are a lot of other great ways that utilities do that. As mentioned in the previous presentation, demand management, being able to flip on and off certain appliances, et cetera. Solar can be a part of that portfolio and can do it very cost effectively. And I think one other thing that is worth mentioning is that there are some communities that are currently served by investor-owned utilities that have said to themselves, well, what can we do to pursue this notion of democratic energy? And a couple of them have done some really remarkable studies of this. One is Boulder, Colorado, which is in the process of forming a city-owned utility instead of being served by Xcel, which is their current utility. And the other one is in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And what they did essentially was an economic study and also a technical study of their local energy system, and said, well, what could we do differently? What is the opportunity, not only to meet our energy needs, from an engineering standpoint, but economically? And in Boulder, they found that they could double the amount of renewable energy on their local system. They could cut in half carbon emissions. They could stop using coal power entirely, which was of value to the folks in that community, and they could do it at about the same cost per kilowatt hour as Xcel Energy. And so obviously there was very strong motivation in that community to move in that direction. They tried many years to negotiate with Xcel Energy and were not able to come to terms about how they could reach that energy future without forming a city-owned utility, so they're moving ahead with that process. And in Santa Fe, New Mexico, it was a similar story. They could double the amount of renewable energy on the system, and they could do it at about the same or even a lesser cost they've projected to the investor-owned utility. And so, I think what I take away from this is every community, I think, should be looking at this opportunity. That it's likely that most communities are not living up to the potential that they have to tap into their own renewable energy resources and to do so cost effectively. And what's interesting is that it kind of your opportunities differ very greatly. In the case of these communities, they're served by investor-owned utilities. As mentioned earlier, you have really no say unless you're a shareholder. Being a customer doesn't give you any say about the kind of energy mix that utility delivers, nor are you likely to have a way of even reaching them to offer your opinion about what should be done differently. It can be very different when you have a cooperative utility or a municipal utility. The members have a say in how things are changed. The members can run for the board, they can run for city council, they can lobby. But even then there can be interesting limitations. And I'm going to leave you in some ways with a little bit of a down note in the sense that, REA, for example, buys most of its power from GRE. GRE is the transmission and generation cooperative, and they buy a lot of their power on long-term contracts. And so a lot of folks are kind of locked into the energy system they have on these long-term contracts to buy power. It was an economical way to do it. 20 years ago, when there weren't any real other alternatives, it made a lot of sense. But it's one of the things that we have to face down in the way that we are addressing this opportunity, is that we have a lot of money that is sunk into a 20th century energy system. And in the 20th century, economic development and self-reliance was about how do we bring electricity to our community to be the means by which we do economic development, whether it's in agriculture or industry or what have you. And in the 21st century, it is that energy generation itself can be that source of self-reliance and of economic development. But we have to, A, find a way to explore that opportunity and to really recognize it, and B, we may have to really change the way that we've been doing business in order to capture that opportunity. So I'd be happy to take your questions and really enjoy the conversation with you today. Thanks.
Why is Kentucky such a poor state for renewable energy? Mitch McConnell.
That is a great question. It has partly to do with a lower level of resource, and then it's important to note that this is the percentage is a relative measure. So North Dakota is like 50,000%, because there's a whole lot of wind resource and not a lot of people. And so the problem for Kentucky is a relatively large population relative to its renewable energy resource opportunity.
On a residential basis, I think there's a lot of potential for us in our homes to be self-reliant of what you're getting at. But one of the speakers I'd like to address, maybe the REA guy, when it comes to industry, it's a total different realm. When it comes to a farm drying a massive amount of corn, or Donnelly Manufacturing over here running a whole bunch of heavy presses and that kind of thing, how do you look at understanding the big picture as far as the incredible demand for power for industry, for jobs and that kind of thing, compared to the very low-level power we in our residence can probably adjust to with high efficiency light bulbs and batteries and that kind of stuff?
It's a really good point and a really good question. One thing I would say about it that's important to note is that there are very significant opportunities for energy efficiency in industry. That doesn't mean, now they're obviously it's a different creature, because they might run 24/7, so their demand might span the entire day, whereas residential demand rises and falls. There are a lot of conservation opportunities there, and in fact that's something that a lot of folks that I work with have been working on very closely in terms of the implementation of the state's energy efficiency law, but also simply there's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there, electric motors, lighting for industrial use, and whatnot. But what that does suggest too is that when we talk about democratic energy or distributed energy, I'm not talking about, you know, that notion of like putting the utility out of business and having a battery and a solar panel. I mean, it may be that should we not find sort of a good middle ground in the long run and good policy, that's what will happen, that retail prices will rise because we sort of do business as usual, and some customers will start to sort of leave the system or whatever, and the rest will sort of pick up the cost for that. The prices go up to a point where it becomes economical to do that because of the technology, and a whole bunch of people start leaving the system and making it problematic. And you know, that's the sort of cell phone versus landline problem, if you will. In my mind, that's not the way you want to do it. An electric system is a very, you know, we talk about it sort of the largest battery in North America. We've built out this very reliable system for providing us round-the-clock power. I think we should continue to use it rather than try to forego it. Now, what that doesn't mean, though, is that we shouldn't find ways to maximize the way that our energy dollars stay in the community. So, do we want to be part of MISO? Do we want to be interconnected with other communities? Yes. But if there's a chance to generate more of the energy locally, to keep more of the dollars that we spend coming back here, you know, I always speak of it in terms of energy dollar, in part because we get really hung up in the energy business of talking about what's the price per kilowatt hour. And what I like to think about is I'm spending $100 a month. Maybe I'm willing to spend $105 a month if I know that, you know, twice as much of that energy dollar is actually staying local within the community, is creating jobs, is you know, what have you. So I think that's sort of a long way around answering your question, which is saying I think that collectively there are ways to do that. So it's not just me putting up a solar panel and trying to be really efficient in my home. It's saying that the cooperative can invest in building renewable energy generation on behalf of all of its customers, and can do that more cost effectively than we can individually, can, you know, serve those notions of self-reliance and economic development, and do it for all different kinds of customers.
Maybe I won't force you into the car business.
You know, I just was going to, what you're talking about right now is that district energy in downtown St. Paul. Are you familiar with that?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you're, kind of the thing that
That's certainly one way to go about it. I mean, the district energy system is, it's a combined heat and power facility, so it's very efficient, and it's actually something that's very common in Europe. The response to the energy crisis in the 70s, a lot of Scandinavian countries, for example, really doubled down on combined heat and power. So they actually still use a fair amount of like coal power, for example, but almost every facility is combined heat and power, and it has a district heating system that serves that community. So you mentioned, I think there was a coal plant in Alexandria previously. What they did there is they retrofitted a lot of their power generation facilities to provide heating services to the community, and so it gives them a very high efficiency use for energy, and also, you know, a lot of that local benefit. They're kind of expensive. You know, they're expensive to set up, frankly. You know, the system that was mentioned, I think, at the Spiritwood plant is a little easier because it's sort of one industrial customer can take all of that load versus having to build out a network. But on the other hand, in the long run, it can be extremely cost effective, and certainly from, you know, a climate or even just a cost effectiveness standpoint, we're getting much more bang for our buck when we use those kind of high efficiency systems.
You're watching Inform TV, Alexandria, Minnesota. You're watching Inform TV, Alexandria, Minnesota.